Okay, this whole chapter is talking about how to interpret graphs, and that requires us to know some vocabulary words. Last time we had class, we talked about line symmetry and point symmetry. So we were looking at the symmetry of different graphs. We also were determining whether a graph was linear or nonlinear. Now we're going to look for extrema. Now, extrema, we start by looking for our max and minimums, right? So our maximums and minimums. Relative and absolute, we do after we find our max and min. So I wrote a little reminder there. Remember, when we're interpreting graphs, when we interpret graphs, we read graphs by following the curve from left to right. So that means I'm starting here, and then I'm gonna follow that graph. Okay, so I'm gonna start here because this is the left side of the graph right here. This is the left side of the graph, and I'm heading to the right side. So we always read from left to right. Okay, I've also included here when is it a max and when is it a min. So here we see max is when your graph is increasing and then changes or turns to decreasing. Your minimum is when your graph is decreasing and it starts increasing. So let's follow this graph, and let me choose a different color here. Choose this one. And if I follow this graph, I start here, and I notice I'm going up. Also included those terms here. Okay, up is increasing, down is decreasing. So I'm going up, so I'm increasing. I'm going up, I follow the curve of the graph, and notice I get to a certain point here, where it changes. There's a change that happens. So I know there I will have a maximum or an extrema, let's say. Okay, and there's an extrema here, but I see that I went from increasing to decreasing. That's this one. So that's a maximum. So I'm going to say here, this is a max. Okay, let's continue. And I'm decreasing, and then I get to a certain point here where it changes, and now it starts to increase again. And I get to a point here where it changes and it starts to decrease because it's going down, and so forth. So there's some terms that happen here. Every time you see a turn like that, there is an extrema there. Okay. Now, since I'm going decreasing to increasing, this point is going to be a minimum. And this point here is going from increasing to decreasing, so this one will also be a max. So I have two maximums and one minimum. Okay, now to determine whether it's a relative maximum or min or an absolute, well, if there is an absolute, tells you that's absolute. There's no other value on that curve that goes either lower if it's a minimum or higher if it's a maximum. So we have one absolute maximum here, and that's this point here. And I'm going to abbreviate again. Absolute. So that is that point. That is your absolute max. Why? Because if I look at anything, let me choose a different color. If I look at anything higher than that point, so I drew a line there across. If you notice how you don't see any blue curve above that line. that is why that one is absolute. There is no other value greater than that maximum. This one, for instance, right here, is also a max because it goes from increasing to decreasing, but I do have values for this one, for this point right here. I do have values, and those values are all this part of the graph. All these values are greater than that one. Okay, so that one would just be a relative maximum. If I look at this minimum right here, this minimum, I do see that if I draw a line, I do see that I have blue curve underneath that line. So it is a minimum because it's decreasing to increasing, but I do have the curve of the line, that blue curve of the graph below that line. So there are other minimum values that are not extrema, but they're lower values than the one than that relative minimum. So this one is a relative minimum. Now, in your assignment, you're going to be asked to find the x coordinate. So, other assignments require you to find the coordinates of your extrema. So what we do there is what you guys done for a while now. At the relative maximum, I'm gonna go down to my x, see what value I have there. I'm gonna also go to my y and see what value I have there. So my relative, depending on what they ask you to find, I believe your assignment says find the x coordinate, so you only have to find the x value. In this case, that would be -2. And for my y would be 5. For this relative minimum, I have 0 for my x, I have a +3 for my y. This absolute maximum, again, what am I doing? I'm drawing a line, like an imaginary line down here to see what my x value is, and that would be 3. And I go to my y-axis, and I see that value is, if this is 5, if this one right here is 5, 6, 7, 8. So that would be a +8. So I believe like I said, your homework only has you finding x coordinates. So just include these numbers. Just write x equals -2, x equals 0, x equals 3. There's not always will you have an absolute maximum or an absolute minimum is not necessarily in every single graph. So some graphs we may have only a relative minimum. Some graphs we may have a relative minimum and a relative maximum, but no absolutes. Okay, so I'm gonna just draw a graph that is not on the graph paper so much, or the x and y axis here, but I'm gonna do it here on the side and show you if we had a graph that went like this and just kept going up and down here. This would be a relative max. This one would be a relative minimum. Okay, like I said, if you want, find max and min, and then determine whether it's absolute. Again, these are both relative because I have minimum values. I have lower values than this, than where that relative minimum is at, and then I have higher values, which is here, that are greater than that maximum. Okay, so if you look at quadratic equations, if your quadratic equation looks like that, then this one would be a relative minimum. And you see there, your arrows just keep going up, so there is no turn, there is no change. Now, it just has a relative minimum. But you may say, wait, isn't that an absolute minimum because there is no other value below it? Well, the absolute minimum is mainly when you have other maximums. So, like my first example, you see I had two maximums. So we have to label them. Now, you could have two maximums that are both relative. Okay, so just keep that in mind, and that'll be the last one here. If you had a graph that looked like this, both this point and this point would be relative maximums because my arrow continues to go up as I go to the right. So I have values that are greater than that, so it is not an absolute. Okay, one last thing. Your assignment asks to find your zeros. Now we've mentioned this before, just in case if you forgot. Zeros are just a fancy term to represent x-intercept. Okay, what is your x-intercept? So if they say what is the zeros of that graph, then that would be here and here. Okay, so zeros at x equals -5, and right here looks like it's somewhere between 6 and 7. Okay, so 6.5 would be your other zero. Okay, if that's the case, if the line goes right through the middle, you don't have to be exact. The instructions do say estimate. So that should be enough examples there, so to complete your assignment.